We're in 1 Corinthians chapter 16 today, jumping over chapter 15 because we've already done it, but we are in chapter 16 looking at verses 1 to 4. If you were here last week and you came back this week, thank you. Really appreciate you doing that. In all seriousness, last week was good because God's word is always good, but it's also tough. It was a tough topic, but I actually think this week's text and topic is tougher because today's text is all about money and the giving of money. And you're going to listen to a pastor talk about the importance of giving money. And so I think that's a tough topic. That's a tough topic to talk about, quite honestly. It's also a tough topic. It's a tough topic to hear because in our world, my money is my business, right? You stay out of my money. Pastor man, stay away from my money. I mean, in our world today, let's just say, for example, we met today for the first time. Out in the lobby, we're just hanging out. Hi, I'm Norm. Hi, who are you? Dave. Dave, what do you do? That would be an appropriate question. What do you do for a living? What would be a totally inappropriate question, especially the first time that we met, is how much do you make, Dave? What do you clear every month? Because my money is my business. You'd look at me cross-eyed, like, who is this guy? What are you talking about? Three realities that come with our money in our world today. One, we measure our worth by it. Number two, we rest our security on it. And number three, we're very comfortable in our relationship with it, meaning the only problem that we have with money is that we don't have enough of it. That's the only issue. A number of years ago, I was listening to Tim Keller talk about a midweek series that he did on the 7 deadly sins. And he was about to leave his apartment one night, and his wife, Kathy, asked him what he was speaking on that night. What was the topic? And he said, the sin of greed. She said to him, oh, you won't get many people out tonight. And he said, why? And her response was, because most people don't think they're greedy. And it turned out she was right. Not many people showed up. I mean, raise your hand if you think you have too much money. Nice. That's good. We got one. Let's talk after. We've got some projects we want to do here. I mean, not many of us are like Walter White on the end of Breaking Bad when he had to find places to store all of his money. Raise your hand if you think you have too little, right? It's interesting, isn't it, that the thing that poses perhaps the greatest threat to you and me entering heaven is something that we want more of. I wrote that this week, 5:33 p.m. on Thursday, and I haven't been able to get it out of my head. That the thing that poses perhaps the greatest threat to you and me entering heaven is something that we want more of, that we don't think we have enough of. I mean, it's hard for the rich to enter the kingdom. It's the deceitfulness of riches that snatches the seed from the third soil in the parable of the seed and the soils. Those who desire to be rich fall into snares and temptations and ruin and destruction. All those things that I just said, the New Testament says. Money is no small matter. And what's also true about money and you and me is that a Christian's relationship with money should look different than the world and the relationship it has with it. So with that in mind, if you're not there already, turn to 1 Corinthians 16, and as you find it, let me pray. Please join me in prayer. Lord, please guide our thoughts. Lord, please guide our hearts. And Lord, please guide my words as I teach yours. Amen. It was about 10 months ago believe it or not, that we went through chapter 15 in our Easter series, our resurrection series. It's a chapter 15, a chapter heavy on doctrine, the doctrine of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's a doctrine of first importance. Chapter 16 is heavy on the practical. But that's not to say that we don't learn a lot from it. We do. And in today's passage, we learn a lot about money and giving and generosity and how the gospel should influence everything we do, and that includes how we deal with our cash. In verse 1, if you have your text open, Paul begins, "Now concerning the collection for the saints." If you've been keeping track at home, this is the 6th time that Paul uses this expression, "now concerning," and every use is in response to a question that the church had sent to him in letter form. It began all the way back in chapter 7, where Paul writes, "Now concerning singleness." Chapter 7, verse 25, "Now concerning marriage." Chapter 8, verse 1, "Now concerning food offered to idols." 12, verse 1, "Now concerning spiritual gifts." We've been there for the last number of months. Next week, chapter 16, verse 12, "Now concerning Apollos." And here, in chapter 16, verse 1, "Now concerning the collection for the saints." Who are the saints? Well, the saints, if you drop down to verse 3, are the Christians that are living in Jerusalem who had come under great persecution because of their faithfulness to Jesus. Persecution that began with the martyrdom of Stephen in Acts chapter 7 and went out from there. Loss of relationships, loss of jobs, loss of life. And so the question for Paul from the church in Corinth is, how can we help? Which is greatly ironic, isn't it? Do you see the irony of this? Paul is responding to the Corinthians about the persecution of Christians in Jerusalem that had begun with him. Christians in Jerusalem now impoverished and destitute and reliant on the generosity of others. Churches that had been blessed by the church in Jerusalem, now they were reliant on them, meaning the church of Jerusalem was reliant on the ones that they helped before. They had gone from a place that Luke in Acts chapter 4 describes as having no need among them, now being absolutely dependent upon others. So go back to verse 1. What's Paul's instruction? So Paul writes next, "In light of your question, as I directed the churches in Galatia, so you also are to do." The churches in Galatia is a region. They're the churches that Paul, in his first missionary journey with Barnabas, planted. You can read about that in Acts chapter 13, or Acts chapters 13 and 14. Churches like Pisidian, Iconium, Lystra, Derbe, and Antioch, where Christians were first called Christians. But let me show you a map, okay? This is Map Sunday. This is Laser Pointer Sunday. This is a big deal. So that's a map, obviously, first century Palestine region, Israel and the like. Where are we? Well, down here below, that's Jerusalem. That's where the war is going on right now in that area. If you've heard the expression from the river to the sea, that's the river, the Jordan, that's the sea, the Mediterranean. Where's Corinth? Well, Corinth is way up here in Greece. Just west, you can see it right there, just west of Athens. Where's Galatia? Well, Galatia's right here. Most of the churches that were planted were right here. Paul is probably writing this letter from Ephesus. But what I want you to notice, and this will come up later, is how far Corinth is to Jerusalem. So it's a trip. Just keep that in mind as we go from here. What's significant about the churches in Galatia is that they're predominantly Gentile. And Corinth had somehow heard that the churches in Galatia, Gentile churches, were putting funds aside to help the church in Jerusalem, which was predominantly Jewish. And so they wrote to Paul about it. Paul's response, "Do what I've instructed the Galatian churches to do." It's a sweet picture. It's a sweet picture of the new nation where we are no longer separated by language and by border and by ethnicity. Paul goes on to instruct them very specifically. Take a look at verses 2 to 4, and what comes next. Here's his instruction, very practical. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up, as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. And when I arrive, I will send those whom you accredit by letter to carry your gift to Jerusalem. If it seems advisable that I should go also, they will accompany me. What should we take from this? What nuggets of truth can we grab from these 3 verses and apply to our lives? Like I said, it's very practical. So let me give you a handful of them. Number 1 is our giving should be planned. Paul writes in verse 2, on the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up. The first day of the week is Sunday. Today is the first day of the week. It's the day when the church began gathering soon after its birth in honor of the resurrection of Jesus. It's why we gather on a Sunday. Is it wrong to gather on another day? No, it's not wrong. But the early church decided to meet on the day Jesus rose from the dead in honor of Jesus rising from the dead, because our faith rests on Jesus rising from the dead. And I don't think we should discount that. But it's not always possible for ministries to gather on a Sunday, but that's why they gathered on the Sunday. Sundays began being referred to as the Lord's Day. If you've read the book of Revelation, Revelation 1 starts with John on the island of Patmos on the Lord's Day in the Spirit, receiving the apocalypsis, what became known to us as the book of Revelation. Christians then would work all day on the first day of the week because it was a work day. The day off was the Sabbath, the Saturday, and then they would gather most often in the evenings. Weekends didn't become a thing until the mid-1800s in honor of the Jewish people and the Christians living in the States predominantly. They met on the first day of the week, so they would work all day and then they would meet Sunday night. So the question, is it wrong to work on a Sunday? They all did then. And Paul's counsel was that every Sunday they put aside some cash, and when he arrived, it would be collected. So this is a giving towards a specific project. This wasn't a giving towards the day by day, week by week needs of the church itself. We aren't given any information about that. This is project-based giving. So that's the counsel from Paul. When you gather, bring some money, put it in a big pot, and when I arrive, people with me will take it, if you think I should go to Jerusalem and hand it off. Things are way different today when it comes to our giving. I grew up, and I'm sure many of you did too, going to church where on Sundays offering plates were passed around. That's not too much in our past. I've gone to places where they use Kentucky Fried Chicken buckets. So bags, plates, but whatever it took, right? There's always a time midstream, usually right before someone spoke, somebody would play the organ for about 70 seconds, pass the plates around, and that's how we did giving. Again, not very common today. We don't do that predominantly because most people give online today. People don't write checks today. People don't carry cash today. Most people aren't reliant on having to even show up to give. Giving happens automatically. Giving just comes out of their account. That's how I give. I give automatically every Monday morning, 52 times a year. Regardless, though, on the differences, don't miss the big point for us, and that is the overarching direction is the same. Our giving should be organized. Our giving should be disciplined. And the reason Paul gives, take a look at verse 2. The reason Paul gives is so that there will be no collecting when I come. Why is this important? What's Paul getting at here? Well, I think what Paul is addressing is our tendency and inability to give what we intended in the moment versus giving when planned. And I say that because research shows that we will give more when we budget for it. We will give more when there is a plan of attack versus in the spur of the moment giving, and it's not even close. I think Paul speaks to this in 2 Corinthians chapter 9 when he writes, each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. What you need to know about 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9, Paul's lengthiest discourse on giving, it's written in response a year later to this letter, what we're reading today, because they hadn't done it yet. So Paul's doubling back and he's saying to them, you decided something in your heart, and so I'm asking you to fulfill what you decided in your heart. And that phrase, decided in your heart, speaks of a plan. It speaks of pre-consideration, of sitting down and thinking through your income and your obligations and considering what you have the ability to give and setting your heart to it. So that's number one of the nuggets. Our giving should be planned. Number two, our giving should be a shared effort. Going back to verse 2, Paul writes that each of you should put something aside. Each of you. Meaning ministry support shouldn't rest on a few. Giving should be a body partnership, regardless of what you can or cannot give. I'll talk about why that is when I close, but it shouldn't land on the deep pockets of some. In fact, there's great danger in ministry in doing that, because the temptation for leadership in a ministry when it rests on the few deep pockets of some is to placate to them, because you're so reliant on their giving. Giving should be a shared effort. Thirdly, our giving should be proportionate to our income. So going back to verse 2, when Paul writes that our giving should be as he may prosper, that strange expression, but he's saying that our giving should align with what we make. In other words, our prosperity should determine our giving. And all of our prosperity is different. You may have more or less. Paul's point, it should be done in proportion to our income. In other words, give in light of what you have, not what you don't have. Going back to 2 Corinthians in chapter 8, verse 12, he says, giving should be done in accordance to what a person has, not accordance to what he does not have. To put it a different way, Midtown, giving should be a joy, not a burden. Again, going back to 2 Corinthians chapter 8, Paul writes, for I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened, but that as a matter of fairness. Number 4 of 5 coming out of this text. A church's giving should come with checks and balances. Just notice one more time what Paul writes in verses 3 and 4. It says, when I arrive, I will send those whom you accredit by letter to carry your gift to Jerusalem. If it seems advisable that I should go also, they will accompany me. It's as if Paul doesn't even want to touch the money. Others, he says, can take the funds to Jerusalem, and only those you sign off on and accredit with a letter. And then in verse 4 Paul says, if you think it's a good idea that I go, I will go, but not by myself. I'll go with those that you have signed off on. Why so careful? Well, I think we could all come up with answers for that question. I think it's because Paul understood the implications that come with money. I think he understood the temptations that come with money. I think he also understood that people can be suspect of us in our handling of money. I believe he also knew how discredited his ministry, his life personally would be if people thought there was improper use and handling of the funds that were given. I mean, just understand what Paul is saying, and this is where I go back to the map. He's telling these people by letter, In fact, instructing them as an apostle, set aside money every week, each one of you. Just keep on setting it aside. Keep on setting it aside. I'll come. I'll collect it with some. I'm going to travel all the way down to Jerusalem. You won't see it again. Probably won't hear about what's going on for a while. And I think Paul presumed that some may be thinking, how do we know Paul's on the up and up? Remember, this church questioned Paul and his apostleship. And so Paul says, I don't want to handle it. I actually don't even really want to go with it. Checks and balances. We do our best to have checks and balances here. Staff have no access to Midtown's finances. Our giving is handled by our finance team. Our account can only be deposited into, it can't be taken out of. Checks require 2 signatures, like I'm sure many of your businesses do as well. I don't have signing authority. All purchases over $300 need to be approved. Yearly budgets need the approval of the members of this body. And every year we have our books reviewed by an accounting firm, a review engagement. And that engagement is then presented to the membership at our yearly family meeting, our AGM. I, like the rest of the staff, I take a salary and I don't get a bonus based on weekly income that comes in. If Midtown took in $10 million this Sunday, it wouldn't change my bottom line. I wouldn't show up next week in a Bentley with, Midtown vanity plates on the back of it. That wouldn't happen. I don't determine my salary. That's determined by the leadership. I've only asked for a raise one time in 30 years of ministry, and that was in my second year at Westside when I was making $56,000 a year, and I asked for a bump to $65,000, what I was making when I left Willingdon to plant it. I'm trying to be as transparent in this as possible so that you know the model of verses 3 and 4 is taken to heart in how we do things here, because there needs to be checks and balances. So those 4 points, here we are. Those 4 points, our giving should be planned, our giving should be shared, our giving should be proportionate, and our giving should be above board, all come out of this passage. A fifth of 5, a fifth point that doesn't show up here, isn't seen here, but I want to point it out anyways because it's not seen here, and that is our giving shouldn't be measured with a tithe. What is tithe? What does it mean? It means tenth. And there is no mention of tithing in our passage. And I bring it up because there is no mention of tithing in our passage. In fact, there is only one mention of tithing in the New Testament. And that's when Jesus is rebuking the Pharisees because they were tithing on their spices and they were neglecting the weightier matters of the law. But the law did require tithing, but not in the way you may think. In the Old Testament, the people of God were required to tithe 10%. 10% of their income every year to the temple, but also 10% of their income every year to the feasts. They could feast back then. Well, and 10% every 3 years to the poor. So on average, the people of God in the Old Testament gave 23% of their income to various projects. And then there were free will offerings on top of that. Nowhere does the Bible teach tithing from yearly income alone anywhere. Christians today are no longer under the law, but grace. We live in the age of grace. But the age of grace is the call to do more when we can and receive from others when we can't. That's grace. The law says go 1 mile. Grace says go 2. The law says give your cloak away if somebody asks. Grace says give your tunic as well. The law says love your neighbor. Grace says love your enemies too. See, I think 10% is helpful, but it's not the law we live under. For some of us, 10% is far too little. And for others, it's a bridge too far. Just think about it this way. Paul is writing to this church in Corinth to give to another church who had nothing. I think that's true for churches at times. I think that's true for individuals at times. You see, sometimes we can give to the benevolent fund, and sometimes we have to take from it. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 8, at the present time, your plenty will supply what they need, so that in turn their plenty will supply what you need. In other words, you're helping them now because you can. But you know, sometimes you live in a harvest time and sometimes you live in a want time, need time. The harvest is dried up time. And so they may turn around in a year or two or three when the persecution comes to you and you lose your jobs and you'll need help. Supply, demand. We're in each at times in our lives. You get this. We all do. We have seasons. Churches have seasons. Please understand this discussion about 10%. I don't say this so that you give less than 10%. I say this so that you don't live under guilt if you can't. You aren't to live under guilt as it relates to this idea of 10% giving. But I also say this because I don't want you to feel at peace if you give 10% when the Lord is calling you to give more. Going back to a previous point, I think you and I need to check our hearts as it relates to our giving and decide in our hearts what we are able to give. So those are the 5 nuggets coming out of these 4 verses. I want to begin wrapping up my time with the time that I have left by addressing 2 final all-important questions. Those 2 questions, why don't we give? Like, what's going on? What are the reasons why? And why should we give? After all, my money is my money. My money is my business. Why should we give? Well, let me give you some reasons why we don't give. There are many. I'll just give you a few very quickly. 1, going back to a previous point, lack of planning and laziness. If we don't plan to give, we won't give. Or at least we won't give as much as we could if we had planned. And this lack of planning oftentimes comes because of laziness. The book of Proverbs talks about this all over the place. Just to give you a couple of examples. Proverbs 13:4, the soul of the sluggard craves and gets nothing, while the soul of the diligent is richly supplied. This is a call, please hear me, big word today, all important word, stewardship. We are called to steward God's varied grace in our lives. Time, talent, treasure. 1 Peter 4:10, we are to be faithful stewards of God's varied grace. In context there, Peter's talking about our spiritual gifts. But it's all grace. What do we have that we have not received? It all comes from him, and we're to steward it and steward it well. So that's one reason, lack of planning, laziness. A second reason is debt. This is a big one. Another verse from Proverbs, this chapter 22, verse 7, the rich rules over the poor, and the borrower is the slave of the lender. Some of you probably know what that feels like. A big Pew Research paper came out a number of years ago on giving in the church. Big, wide, in-depth research paper. And that research that came out of that Pew report shows that those in the church, on average, far exceed those not in the church in their giving, in their donations. It's not even close. People that attend church generally give much more. What is the average, though, of the average church attender in their giving? Well, the average is 3%. And that far exceeds, like I said, those not in the church. The majority of people that aren't involved in a church give nothing at all, the majority. If they do give, it's not really planned. It's maybe a one-time at the end of the year gift, $500 to the United Way, maybe do a kids project at school, some kind of thing like that. And so, yes, people that attend something like this give on average far more. And yet 3% may shock you. And part of the reason is because in spite of the giving pattern of those in the church, far more is spent in servicing debt, which I don't think probably surprises a lot of us. And I'm not even talking about quote unquote good debt, like debt that goes towards an appreciation, property of some sort. I'm talking about credit card debt and the like. Another reason we don't give, greed and envy. See, the reality is people love money. We love it. And so why get rid of that which you love? Paul writes in 1 Timothy 6 that the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. One of the qualifications of an elder is that they not be a lover of money. Solomon, as you know, wisest man who ever lived apart from Christ, he wrote the book of Ecclesiastes. Great book. Basically, it's a summary of, I'm looking at the world and what people give themselves to. They chase this, they chase this. It's all vanity of vanities. Listen to what he says. It's not on the screen. It should be. That's my fault. Ecclesiastes 4:4. He writes, and I saw that all toil and all achievement spring from one person's envy of another. Do you hear that? Their work and their achievement, the heart of hearts, is birthed out of envy of what others have. And he sums it up and says, this too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. The 10 Commandments speak to this. The 10 Commandments speak to this, that we should not covet what our neighbor has. But greed and envy keep us from giving. One final before I make a turn for home in this, and that is fear. Fear keeps us from giving. Fear of giving up that which you trust most. Fear of having little or no money, what that will mean. Fear of what others will say. And a greater fear of that than a fear of the Lord. And trust in him. Again, Proverbs 15:16 this time. Better a little with fear of the Lord than great treasure and trouble with it. So those are some reasons. In your CGs this week, you can throw out other reasons that you could add to the list. So let's move to the final question before we respond together. And that is, why should we give? Why should we? Well, a lot of reasons, but again, very quickly, number one, there are needs that God calls us to supply, especially the needs of the saints. That's what's going on here. This is a church coming around the church. This is just another call for the one another's. Galatians 6:10, as we have opportunity, let's do good to everyone, and especially those who are of the household of faith. So that's one reason. Additionally, it's a tangible display that our hope isn't set on riches. It's the fool who dies with his barns full, Jesus says. Another reason is because it honors the Lord and recognizes that all comes from him. Honor the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruits of your produce, Proverbs 3:9. Additionally, when we give to others, it leads to thanksgivings to God. in a verse that I put on every giving letter that I send out every year at the end of the year with your tax receipts, 2 Corinthians 9:12. For the ministry of this service is not only supplying the needs of the saints, but is also overflowing in many thanksgivings to God. So those are some reasons to give, all good reasons to give. But the primary reason we should give, first and foremost, of our time, of our talent, of our treasure, is because our God is a giver, and we are to take after him. For God so loved that he gave. Our giving should be done in response to his, as an act of worship, as an act of recognition. See, we aren't to be mere takers. I've given you a lot of verses today. Just listen to this one last text as I close. 2 Corinthians 8, I am not commanding you to do this. It's interesting. But I am testing how genuine your love is by comparing it with the eagerness of the other churches. Then he says this, you know the generous grace of our Lord Jesus Christ. Though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that by his poverty he could make you rich. That's the gospel. Jesus, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. He became a man, not just a man, a servant man. Obedient, not only obedient to the point of death, not only death on a cross. He emptied himself. He gave up all that was rightfully his. He became absolutely destitute, impoverished. And what do we receive? If we come to Jesus in faith, the heavenlies. The heavenlies. Co-heirs with Christ. By his poverty, we became rich. And so Paul says, let that be your motive for giving. You see, one last comment. When we come here on a Sunday, and maybe you give here on a Sunday, you strike a check. You take your checkbook out, you write a check, $100. You put it in the little slot, you walk up, you know you're walking out. You know what happened in that transaction? You became poorer. You became poorer. And others became richer. Every time you and I give, we become poorer, but most importantly in this, every time we give and we become poorer, we display the gospel. We follow the example of our leader, becoming poorer so others could become richer, as it were. That's why we should give. That's why we should give.